really doesn't make any sense to follow any points I've charged out before after having listened to the previous speakers and having listened to the previous speaker here. I'll just make a few observations deriving from the recent discussions we've held in the last hour or so. I'll start by saying that I believe that Russia will soon, and this actually echoes what was said here by the previous speaker, Mr. Sokor, I believe very soon Russia will come up with a new proposal how to handle or how to create a new security architecture. And that, by the way, has been a pattern in the last 60 years. We've seen proposals by Mr. Molotov, by Mr. Khrushchev, by Mr. Gorbachev about the European House, then Mr. Kozyrev, and Mr. Medvedev just recently in 2008. And these are the different proposals about the European security, but if you take away the intricacies of the politics of the time, there is one thing that unites them all. And what unites them all is Russia's willingness to have a veto over the European security. And I think that is just as true, if not most true today than it was before. So there will be time when, in the nearest future, when these discussions will probably resume. What I'm afraid of is that those discussions will be against a very strong Russia, not the kind of Russia that was there before, but a stronger Russia. And in those discussions, there is a chance, there is a danger that some of the principles on which European security rests now might be jeopardized. Another point I want to make is that I don't think there is anything wrong with the values on which the OSCE or the European security rests. These values are there and we all respect them, except for one country, which has clearly decided to disrespect all of the Helsinki 10, but at the same time to reinterpret some of those values and to bring in the new concepts, new values which makes those values blurry. For instance, the concept that the indivisible security is from Vancouver to Vladivostok, and the concept that nobody should expend their security at the expense of the other. The way these concepts are treated by Moscow is to say that they should not be undermined by the expansion of NATO and the European Union. In the future discussion about the European security, about the European security architecture, I think this will be the core, fundamental issue. Should the states in the east of Europe, as Mr. Sokor said, should they have the right to continue integration into West, into NATO, into the European Union, in the circumstances when Russia is ready to even use force to stop them? And there I have three scenarios, and I will end with just with outlining those three scenarios very briefly. I believe the one scenario and the disastrous scenario will be if, on the record, major European countries, and let's make no mistake, there are leaders in Europe right now who would love to institutionalize the kind of new security architecture which would effectively prevent the countries of the Eastern Partnership going further with their integration efforts. So in the first scenario, you will have a formal consensus that the countries of the Eastern Partnership, the countries of Eastern Europe, will not integrate into the EU and NATO. I think that will be the disastrous scenario, because as soon as you have a formal consensus on that, the chance of these countries being swallowed by Russia increases and actually becomes imminent. The second scenario will be where there will be, as diplomats love to say, constructive ambiguity about the fate of these countries. And I think that is equally dangerous, because in the discussion or in the agreement over the security architecture, where there is the implicit consent, not the explicit consent, but the implicit consent that Ukraine, Georgia, Moldova are not going to be accepted by NATO and the European Union. But they will not say it openly. I think that scenario is just as dangerous as the first one. And then there is a third scenario. And the third scenario, I believe, is not entirely likely. However, I think is the only viable solution in this discussion, which is a clear standing by the principles. The principle that any country has the right to choose its own alliance and to integrate into whichever alliance they want. The reason I'm saying this is that in the discussions that we are having, not only within the OSCE, but also the high-level politicians are having, also on the record, we see the elements of the first and the second scenarios publicly. For instance, we see very openly that there are some states, some skeptical states, which are reluctant to further pursue Georgia's NATO aspirations. They are ready to repeat that Georgia is making progress on the way to NATO, but are reluctant to give Georgia the membership action plan, or are reluctant to give the concrete guideline how to get into NATO. There are countries who are saying on the record that they see Europe and see Ukraine and Georgia and Moldova as the European states, but are reluctant to give us the clear European perspective or the promise of the membership of the European Union, even if that is a long-term promise. So I'll end here by once again repeating that in the discussion of the future security architecture, whether it takes place within the OSCE or outside of the OSCE, between the West and Russia, it is important to keep in mind that the current principles of Helsinki Final Act need not be changed, they need not be revised, they need not be discussed. The only way out is to be resolute and to stand up for these values and to tell Russia that the eastern part of Europe has the right to integrate into the rest of Europe, just like the Central and Eastern European countries did so. Thank you.
Sergei, thank you very much. Robert, I'm going to